So welcome everybody. If you're here to talk about leveling up round 3, then you're in the right place. It might seem a little early to be thinking about this, given that the bidding window hasn't opened, but if you're here thinking about this now, then you're definitely one of the wise ones. Just to do some introductions, my name's Andrew Laird. I'm the Chief Executive of Mutual Ventures. My colleagues and I have been supporting a range of councils to bid for levelling up funding, but then also deliver the projects as well. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by John Bennett from one of our councils that we've worked with. John is the Head of Economy, Jobs and Partnerships at Lewisham Council, and we'll be talking about their experience of a successful bid in round 2. Also joined by my colleague Mark Bandali, as I usually am on these levelling up webinars. Mark has supported a range of councils across the country on not only levelling up bids and the running of the implementing of levelling up projects, but also levelling up and place strategies as well. So before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. You will be able to post questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use that. As chair, I'll try to get to as many questions as I can when we get to that section. And also we're recording it, so the recording will be made available. So there's no need to take notes. We've only got one slide, I think, in the whole session. We can send that out, and you can share the recording with anybody who might have missed it, or if you want to watch it again, you can do that also. So levelling up is still the flagship agenda of this government. We've had 2 rounds of levelling up funding last year and the year before. And in terms of the budget, there's about 1 billion left to be used up. Now, 1 billion used to feel like a lot of money. It's probably not so much these days, looking at the numbers which are bandied around government, but there's still a lot of potential there to get really good funding for your local projects. In terms of timing, round 3 isn't open yet, but it will open sometime this year. But the core message that you will hear from Mark, and I would say from John as well, is it's never too early to start planning and to start thinking, to start trying to learn the lessons from what's been successful in rounds 1 and 2, but also doing some of the preliminary work that if you wait until the bidding window opens, you'll be pressurized and the quality of work won't be as much, and you'll get crushed in terms of the time that you need to actually write the bid. So as many decisions as you can make prior to the bidding window opening is always a really good idea. So in terms of what we're covering today, John's going to talk about the experience of Lewisham and their round 2 bid. Then we're going to talk about lessons learned from rounds 1 and 2. So Mark and John will be inputting into that. Then Mark's going to take us through what, right now, if you're thinking about a levelling up round 3 bid, what you should be thinking about, what you should be focusing on. And we'll also talk about some recommended next steps for all of you out there thinking about round 3, and then we'll get into some questions. So without further ado from me, John, you're really welcome, and it would be great to hear a little bit about Lewisham's experience.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andrew, and good to be with you all. Good to see, well, not to see everyone, but see a list of names at the very least. So I'm John Bennett. I'm Head of Economy, Jobs and Partnerships at Lewisham Council. So I'm responsible for things to do with economic development, jobs, business, town centres, that sort of thing. So obviously the Levelling Up Fund was absolutely of interest to us. Like many councils, you know, there's lots of things that we'd like to do, but we don't have the resources ourselves to be able to deliver some of this, and some of the scale of change that we want to deliver for our town centres and our areas. So we did put a bid into round 2. We didn't put a bid into round 1. We did consider it at the time. I remember that, you know, sort of having that conversation, but we felt we weren't ready at that stage. We felt we didn't know quite what we needed to do and where. And we recognised the level of resource that would need to go into a bid for the Levelling Up Fund. So we passed on round 1. We did get some questions about that, you know, sort of FOIs and that sort of thing about what we didn't do and why. But we were definitely in a better position in the run up to round 2. I think, as Andrew mentioned, we started our planning before round 2 was announced. And I think because a bit like the position we're in now, you know, we expected a round 2 to come, although it certainly wasn't kind of definite. The government hadn't said, yeah, we're definitely going to announce round 2 and this is going to be when it's coming. But we were really keen to start the preparation as early as possible. So that was something that I was trying to coordinate within the council, bringing together different council departments. So in our case, public realm, highways, libraries, planning, our assets team, and sort of having that conversation about what we might need to do. But I think before we even got to that stage, the big decision we had to make was about which town centre we focused on as well. You know, Lewisham as a borough, we go from the River Thames down into sort of outer London. We've got a number of different town centres, all with their challenges, all with their sort of histories. And whilst technically we could have put in more than one bid, again, we felt that we didn't have the capacity or the resources or to be able to do more than one bid. So there were the first conversation that we had internally, and particularly the first conversation with sort of the chief executive and some of the members, was about where do we focus our efforts. And we landed on Lewisham Town Centre, and that was the focus of our bid. Just in terms of context, we had 3 different projects in the bid, one around our street market, one that was sort of public realm for the high street, and one on our library building in the town centre. And I think some of those factors influenced as well why we chose Lewisham Town Centre. It was about a town centre that we had some more direct control over, with the street market and the library are sort of the 2 assets that we own in the town centre. So it's about our ability to be able to directly deliver stuff and directly influence things, rather than necessarily working with external partners and particularly private sector partners. Not that that's a bad thing, but I think it just feels like it's a bit more in our grasp to do some of that with the market and the libraries. So yeah, so like I said, we started before round 2 was even announced, drawing together people and thinking through, before we landed on those 3 as being projects, what actually do we want to change in the town centre and why? What is it that we're trying to achieve? And then from that comes some of the projects. We sort of used the round 1 guidance to inform the way that we were thinking about the projects as well, and the fact that we could only have 3 projects within a bid, maximum of 3 projects, and the kinds of things that they might focus on. So I think looking back at the previous guidance is useful, but it wasn't, there were some changes, and Andrew and Mark might be able to talk in more detail if necessary about some of the differences, but you know, they were similar enough to be able to kind of guide the work that we were doing. Getting people together within the council, you know, is always a challenge and always good fun, trying to bring together, you know, even though you're within the same organization, just getting people in a room to start the conversation sometimes is part of the battle. But the carrot to dangle is, this is about, you know, millions of pounds that you might be able to unlock, and some of the things, so around the market and around the library, as a council we needed to do anyway. Our Lewisham Library building is not in the best state of repair as it is. We'd already allocated some money in our capital budget, £600,000 to patch it up. So this was about building on some ideas and commitments that were already there. But I think we got Mutual Ventures involved at quite an early stage as well. So whilst we'd had some internal discussions, even before the kind of bidding round was announced, we did start to work with Mutual Ventures. And that was really useful in helping to shape sort of those projects and start to kind of narrow them down a bit. But it was the announcement of the round 2 funding that really kicked things off. And that really focuses minds then, because you have an end date that you're working towards. But that was a really short window for this kind of work as well. I think it was around, I can't remember exactly, but it was something like 10 to 12 weeks that we had in order to pull the bid together. You know, and that's when you really need to start moving quickly. And, you know, it does take resource as well. There was, you know, I was involved in this. I had one of my team working on it pretty much full time. We had the guys from Mutual Ventures who were doing the drafting of the bid for us and doing that kind of practical side of things. But to feed into that, we were having kind of program level meetings. And I think we were sort of having catch-ups once a week on that. And then each of those 3 projects, we've convened project teams that were meeting, I think once a fortnight, to really develop those ideas and think things through and turn the ideas into plans. And that was that kind of key stage, is taking that, you know, what is an idea, thinking that through, thinking, okay, well, actually, if we're going to deliver that, what does that timescale look like, and making sure that fits with the timescale of the Levelling Up Fund in this case as well. And that kind of coordination and keeping up the pace was really important during the bid writing and bid development period, really driving things along, you know, but at the same time making sure that we were checking in, particularly with our politicians, and making sure that they were cited on what was being proposed, that they were inputting into it, that they had the opportunity to sort of shape things and say, yeah, you know, this is what we need to be doing, or I want to see this really emphasized in the bid. And then also thinking about the buy-in of external partners. So in any town centre, there's always a variety of partners, and making sure as many of them were bought into this and contributing to it in terms of thinking was really important. We don't have a business improvement district in Lewisham Town Centre. There wasn't really a kind of, you know, any formal groups to go through. One of the things that we did do about 6 months before we started to do the bid was form a town centre partnership, which was fairly informal, but was the council, other public sector partners like the police, some of the private sector partners, landowners, that kind of thing, and voluntary sector partners as well, people who were groups who were active in the town centre. That was really helpful in kind of thinking through some of the issues that were prevalent in the town centre and some of the things that we might need to address. And it also meant, on a really practical level, we had a group of people who were ready to support the bid as well, and provide letters of support and say, yeah, we want to see some change in Lewisham Town Centre, and we're really happy to get behind it. On a very practical level, we did have to think about approvals as well. You know, we're a political organisation. We have a directly elected mayor in Lewisham, and so the scheme of delegation works in a particular way. So we knew we had to kind of think ahead and make sure we were on the forward plan and getting a formal decision to be able to submit a bid. And I don't know about kind of other local authorities, but that's certainly, you know, you have to start thinking a couple of months ahead in order to get on the forward plan and then start drafting a report and all that sort of thing. So I definitely kind of make sure people are considering that. Yeah, Mutual Ventures did the writing of the bid, or most of the writing of the bid. That was really helpful. The bid documentation is huge. There's all sorts of different questions in there. I think one of the things that Mutual Ventures helped us to do was start filling in some of that right from the start. So even though we didn't have the project plans in place, we were thinking about things like procurement, governance, some of those kind of aspects that probably wouldn't change no matter, you know, would be in place whatever the shape of the project and whatever we were focusing on. So that was super helpful. I think very quickly I sort of was thinking about how we I sort of thought of it in terms of justifying the bid, or kind of the you know, in terms of justifying it to the government, or making a case, actually would probably be a better description, how we made the case. And there's 5 things that I'm just going to very quickly run through. So firstly, vision. I think it's really important to have a vision for the bid, and being reasonably honest in this group, we retrofitted ours. So we didn't have like a Lewisham Town Centre master plan that had a clear vision that we were working towards. We sort of took our 3 projects and some of the feedback that we got from partners and from others, and formed a vision that neatly sat above that. So don't be afraid to retrofit a vision if needed. You know, I think there are ways of doing that, and to be honest, we've actually built on that since, and we do now have a town centre vision for Lewisham. So we have got that in place. So first, vision's first thing. Engagement is really important, and consultation and feedback, and being able to sort of say, this is what residents want, this is what visitors have said to us, or businesses, partners, you know, and that we pulled together things that we'd already done in the town centre. So it wasn't that we went out and said, we're thinking of doing a Levelling Up Fund bid, what do you think of this? Actually, it's often the case that there are other things that have gone on that you can pull together and use as the evidence to justify a particular approach and particular projects. So I think that was really important for us. terms of building the business case, the technical element is really important, and the technical side of things in terms of urban design or the kind of capital works and all that sort of thing. And I think we ended up with a huge number of appendices with our bid. I think we went up to Appendix Q in the end in terms of labelling. So whether DLUC actually read all those appendices, I don't know, but I think if nothing else, it looks really good. It shows that you haven't just plucked a figure out of thin air as to why you've said something is going to cost X amount. Actually, there's a report from a QS or a report from somebody else that says this is why it's going to cost that much, or why you're suggesting a particular approach might work. So, for example, for us, we're going to have a business hub in our library. So we got a workspace operator to produce a quick report for us that said, yeah, this is feasible, this is how it might work, this is sort of what it looks like. And I think that sort of thing really helps to justify and back up the case for why you're suggesting doing particular things. Finance is obviously important, and from a few different aspects, you have to show that this is going to offer value for money. I think our bid clearly did, but it was about looking at not just value for money in terms of whether the costs are reasonable, but also about whether the return on investment is worth it from a government perspective as well, and being able to demonstrate the outcomes and benefits that are going to be achieved. Match funding is really important. I think we were able to put in 20% match funding, and I think again that just really helped with the balance. That was more than the minimum. I think the minimum requested was 10%, but I think the more you can put in, the more it sort of helps to balance out that sort of return on investment side of things. Inflation was obviously a worry for us at the time we did the bid. The government took several months longer to make a decision than they'd said they would do at the start. So inflation was going up and up and up. That's our big issue at the moment. But the final thing, very practical, MP support. You have to make sure you've got the support of the local MP. That was, to be, again, being very honest, quite easy for us in Lewisham. It took, an email and a very short meeting, and the MP Vicky Foxcroft was like, yeah, of course I want to support this, great. So we didn't really have much convincing to do, but it's a practical thing that you need to make sure you do. So yeah, vision, engagement, technical expertise, finance, MP support. And the final thing I'd say is like be prepared for last minute changes, issues. I think for us there was a couple of things. Firstly, the government moved the deadline. They did end up providing a few more weeks in the end, although we were ready to go with the original deadline. But so there was that. There was also an equalities question that came in right at the end that wasn't on the original form, and the government decided they need to add in. So yeah, you have to be, whilst you've done all that work, you still have to be quite flexible. So yeah, that's a bit of an outline of our experience of doing the bid.
Thank you very much, John. Just you're mentioning the bid itself there. It's almost like a mini version of a Treasury Green Book business case with all those different sections. So strategic, economic case where you have to do all the calculations to show return on investment or benefit cost ratio, then the commercial case to get into all how you're going to procure everything, the finances that you mentioned, and then the management case, which is the practical bit about how you're actually going to do it. A quick follow-up question for you. So you mentioned, and Mark and I were talking before this, and I think the window was either 8 weeks extended to 12 or 12 extended to 16 because of what you mentioned at the end around the procurement or around the portal. But that might sound like a lot of time, but it really wasn't, was it? I mean, if you were to use 6 to 8 weeks at the start of that process, discussing with stakeholders what your projects are going to be, you won't have enough time. You've got to make those decisions before the window.
You really do. And I think we'd pretty much nailed things down in that sense by, I'd say, at most halfway through that bidding window, because I think we came into it with a sense of what it was that we, perhaps the projects that we might put into a bid. So even before the window was open, I think we kind of had the shape of the 3 projects. I think the first half of the bidding window is about refining that, is about putting it into the right structure, thinking about what's deliverable in the timescales that the funding's available for, because I think, again, that was an unknown at the start. When we were thinking about what we might want to do, we didn't know what the window of spend might be. So that really affects what you're going to do. But yeah, absolutely, by about halfway through, we nailed on, okay, these are the 3 projects we're going to get in. And it was about kind of that kind of technical evidence or the tweaks,
Yeah.
and partly because we needed, again, from a practical perspective, we had to get approval on things. You have to take it through the various chains of command and different internal boards, and people need to know
But
what you're
I
going
mean,
in for.
you would have probably had a slightly less stressful time if you'd have figured out what those projects were even a little bit earlier. It might have saved yourself a little bit of hassle as well.
Yeah, and I think, you sort of have to recognize with that sort of thing that you're doing it at risk as well. So there's no guarantee that this funding is even going to be announced or released, or when it might be. And I think we just have to be prepared to take that risk and just say, look, no, we need to come up with these ideas now. We need to think them through as far as possible, so that you're in a really good position to go. And
no, we're
thinking.
Pretty confident that it's coming this year. It's been announced a couple of times, and it would seem, from with a kind of political hat on, it would seem counterproductive for the government to announce this funding and then pull it just before an election. So I would say we're pretty sure it's coming. But just so before I hand over to Mark, just to talk about some. Sorry,
Andrew. Sorry, just before you go on, can I just add one thing to that as well? Yes. And just to say, look, we're a London borough. When you think about levelling up, London boroughs aren't necessarily the place that you think of, and there was a bit of cynicism within the organisation of like, oh well, the government's never going to give us any money, is it? Like, is it even worth us putting in a bid? And I suppose I always felt, I remember we crunched the numbers on round one, and it showed that there is a bit of money that goes to every region. So even if you're in one of those places and you think actually the government's never going to give us any money here, I think it is still worth putting in a bid, because there is some level of like regional distribution, and every place does seem to get some money, and you just got to put in as stronger case as you can for why you ought to get, even if it's it's up to the politicians to decide how big or small that slice of funding is, but it's worth putting in a bid wherever you are, I think.
No, you're absolutely right, and from our own experience, we supported Newham to get 2 successful bids in round one, so they maybe felt the same way, but like you, went for it, put a good bid together, and that was it. So Mark, I'm going to bring you in now just to talk about some of the lessons learned that based on what John's saying there, he's covered a lot, but also from our own experience of round 1 and 2.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. So yes, very much building on John's points. I think what I've done is we've seen feedback that councils have received from unsuccessful round 2 bids, and we've reviewed it, and I think there are some common themes which would be I think wise for councils looking at round 3 to take on board. I think reading between the feedback, I think that there are some things, some commonalities in the feedback, which makes me think that DLUC think that these things are more important than anything else. So using that filter, I try to be as helpful as possible in terms of identifying what those things are. I mean, John's actually very helpfully covered a couple of them. The first one is around gathering and galvanizing and demonstrating stakeholder support through consultations, engagements, and letters of support. So I think that's an incredibly important thing to evidence, but also the firm backing and lobbying by your local MP. It's not just being supportive, it's actually telling other people that they are very supportive of this and having the necessary conversations, I think is incredibly important. And
yeah, there's an amount of arm twisting that MPs can do behind the scenes that, I mean, I won't ask John to comment on this, but it does happen, and it's important to get your MP championing your area.
Absolutely, and I think that the successful bids we've worked on, they have had a mobilised and energised MP to do exactly that. So I think that's important. Equally important within the bid itself is for the council to demonstrate how stakeholders will be involved in the delivery of the project, not just about supporting it, but actually involved in the delivery of it, whatever that may look like, and projects obviously vary, but that was a key point that DLUC made on several councils in terms of you identify the stakeholders, but you didn't really define the path in terms of deliverability. There are some technical things, so apologies for this, but one of the key bits from the feedback was, from a DLUC perspective, it's incredibly important for councils to demonstrate the viability gap and a strong case for investment. So what that means in sort of non-technical is, demonstrating the problem that needs to be solved, or the problems, it's, the market failures and their impact on the council, on communities and on businesses. So that's part one. But part two is very clearly answering the question why LUF funding or public funding specifically is needed, and turning that on its head, why this investment isn't attractive to the private sector, why, you know, the levels of return, it requires public sector investment because the benefits would be social, environmental and commercial, but not to a level that private business would look to sort of invest on return on investment basis. So that viability gap is incredibly important. What's the problem and why do you need enough funding? John's already mentioned, given the state of markets, a clear approach to managing inflation that needs to be evidenced. It needs to be, contingencies need to be built in, risk management, inflation management strategies need to be demonstrated within.
I mean, this was much less of a thing in round one, and in the space of a year, that all changed.
Absolutely. So that and I think for round three, depending on the timing, but well, not depending really, inflation is still going to be an issue. So I think councils will need to take that into account, both from a financial perspective in terms of contingencies, but also in terms of managing supply chains and cost certainty. These things are important. Another technical point made was around the requirement for councils to demonstrate a sort of mini options appraisal, which answers the question, why have you chosen the projects that are included within this bid? What was the long list, and why did this project that you focused on, why was that deemed to be the most suitable? And looking at that from several angles in terms of, you know, alignment with fund criteria, but also the benefits and the cost and cost certainty and so on. So a clear options appraisal demonstrating why the project was selected above others is important. Another thing that was broadly in every bit of feedback we saw was the need for councils to demonstrate how this project or this investment will benefit of the delivery of local and national strategies, that what you're proposing isn't just sort of by itself, it is aligned to what locally and regionally and potentially nationally public partners are looking to achieve here. So, you know, in terms of inequality, in terms of deprivation, in terms of inclusive growth and so on, there needs to be a clear demonstration of how the benefits, the intended benefits, align to a broader strategic outlook across a place or across nationally. So that's really important. Another technical point is there was a clear steer in all of the feedback that councils that used GVA for construction as a measure for benefits, that was considered, so that's gross value added, that was considered to be an inappropriate measure. And although there's debates about that, there was a strong preference from DLUC to use land values as an alternative to GVA for construction. So the non-technical bit of that is, if councils can commission a professional land valuation of the projects, of the area where the project will be based, that's far more palatable in terms of an economic modelling sense and benefit sense than using measures around GVA for construction. And that was a clear message throughout the whole process, really, through all of the feedback. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Land valuations, preferably before and after the investment, to demonstrate what the uplift would be. But I'm not saying don't use GVA for construction, but it has been used as one of the reasons why a bid wasn't successful. So there's a balancing act there, and obviously these things come at a cost in terms of commissioning as well. So it's something for the councils, I think, to balance and weigh up, but be conscious of. Yeah. And the final one was around resourcing. So a lot of feedback was around, you've outlined a clear governance structure, you've been very clear about how you're monitoring and how you'll evaluate the programme, but you haven't been able to point to resources. So there is a requirement in the bid to demonstrate within the deliverability section that the process is clear, yes, but there is a resource, an identified resource to support this process and implement those processes. So that was, and you can kind of understand that in terms of, well, it sounds great on paper, but how will it be delivered? Councils really should answer that question as clearly as they can and be able to point to resources, either internal or external, that will be used to deliver these projects.
Yeah.
And that really is it, just in terms of a synopsis of, I think, council, you know, considering round three, these are the things from round two that were highlighted as, you know, councils need to get this sort of stuff right.
Yeah, brilliant, Mark. I'm glad you just wrapped up there before getting overly technical. But if anybody listening wants to have a chat with Mark or I about this stuff, just to, you know, drop us a line afterwards. I'll include our contact details. The resourcing point's really important, actually, and you know this varies from council to council. I think for single tier authorities, they're more they maybe have a bit more resource and a bit more capacity to deliver projects like this. But certainly for some of our clients who are maybe smaller district councils, they didn't have the internal resource, but you can build that into your bid. You know, you can build that extra funding for delivery capacity into your bid. So you certainly shouldn't be thinking, we're not going to bid for this because we don't have the resource to project manage it. You can build that in to your funding ask. John, was there anything there that you wanted to comment in or anything you wanted to add?
No, I mean, to be honest, the main thing that made me that it sort of reminded me was that you know, that balance of the sort of bigger picture kind of strategic element of like, yeah, what are we going to do, who needs to be involved, and then you know, people needing to get into the technical detail and that kind of the technical backup of things, and that's where having a balance on your project teams or your kind of bid development team, you know, obviously potentially involving external people like yourselves to be able to bring that capacity and that sort of rigor. I think one of the things we found really useful of working with you guys was you bringing your experience both of round one but also of other places as well, and I'm sure you sort of, you know, shared a bit of what we were doing in Lewisham with some of the other places you were working with, and learning from each other and thinking through our different approaches, and I think we did find that really useful.
Yeah, John and Mark as well. I mean, there's something which has really struck me about this process is that levelling up could be viewed through the lens of purely economic growth and thinking about it like that. But certainly the way it's been structured so far, you've got to demonstrate that you're reducing inequality, that it's inclusive economic growth, and that there are investments in social infrastructure. You mentioned a few things, John, when you were talking there. That feels to me like a really positive development in terms of how we think about our places and what it's like to experience living in a place as a resident.
Yeah, and I think for us, that's sort of, that was more of the starting point for what it was that we're trying to achieve through our project, rather than levelling up or the pure economic side of things. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm the head of economic development. I'm interested in economic outputs as well. I want to know about jobs and businesses and vitality of the high street. But you know, as a local authority and certainly as a wider partnership, we are interested in inequalities, interested in health and well-being and the social aspects. So that's definitely an important part of our bid, and it's almost trying to take those kind of wider things that we want to do and frame them in the government's terms for the purposes of the bid, but you don't lose what it is that you're trying to achieve through. So, you know, in our case, the library is a good example of that. So it's a traditional library building at the moment, 3 or 4 stories, although not all of them used in the right way at the moment. And through the bid and the project that we put together, we've got some business space in there, we've got some cultural activity going on, ideally, you know, performances, exhibitions, that kind of thing. We'll still have the library service. We're looking at other services that could come in and use that space. We're looking at how that could be part of our evening and nighttime economy even, and have a bit of a hospitality offer. So it's more than just the economic outputs that are being created, and I think, you know, there are things that perhaps didn't go in the bid or benefits that didn't go in the original bid that we're absolutely looking to achieve.
And John, just before I bring Mark in to talk about what advice on what councils should be focusing on now, just through various conversations with different councils, and this is a really interesting question for Lewisham, I think. I used to live in Lewisham, and some areas are very comfortable in their own skin being a commuter town, if you like, you know, where you have people living and they're traveling, like in Lewisham's case, into central London to work, whereas other parts of the country, and it seems to depend very much on culture and on elected members' views, want to bring jobs to the place. Did you have a set view on that, or I mean, I suppose you can't stop people traveling into London, but was there an ambition to try and get more people staying and working within the borough?
So, I mean, as ever with these things, it was a bit of everything that we were trying to do, and I wouldn't say there was one single thing. You know, I think it's about that balance of, we're always going to be part of the central London economy. People are always going to live in a borough like Lewisham because it's a lovely place to live, but perhaps work elsewhere. But a sense, we had a sense that actually Lewisham, and particularly the Lewisham town centre, right, as much as the wider borough, isn't achieving its economic potential and isn't providing as many jobs as it could be as part of the central London economy, not just as sort of within the borough. So I think that's one of the things that we're trying to address through our project. I suppose the other thing, just in way of context as well, Lewisham's seen massive housing growth in the town centre over the last few years. We've got some, you know, big high-rise blocks that have gone up around the railway station, if people know the town centre at all. And we've got a bit of a divide now, unfortunately, between existing communities and not just social housing or anything like that. You know, it's private rented, private ownership as well. You know, people who were already living within 10-15 minutes of the town centre, and then all these new big blocks, lots of people who've moved in, and we were able to get some data that showed those people who've recently moved into the town centre actually aren't spending money in the town centre. So part of our case was demonstrating that this is about making the town centre more attractive to everyone, whilst not losing the people who are already using it, already spending money there.
Yeah.
It's already providing those much needed services and everything within the town centre.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I asked because the guest on our podcast, Mutual Ventures Radical Reformers, was a guy called Adam Hawksby, who's the deputy director of a think tank called Onward, and they'd been doing a lot of interviews around the country on levelling up, and he gave the two examples, one of Barry in Wales, which is famous from Gavin and Stacey, and then South Shields as well. So Barry, really comfortable being a commuter town for Cardiff. South Shields, totally the opposite, wants to create jobs and keep people within the town if it possibly can. So it's just a really interesting kind of strategic question, I suppose. So Mark, I want to come to you now just to give some advice on, you know, for the councils listening, what they should be thinking about now.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So I think let's recognise that every council is going to be in a slightly different position. Some will have been unsuccessful in previous bids. Some will not have bid so far to previous rounds. So I would focus on the sort of core aspects of the LUF framework that really, yes, we don't know what LUF round 3 looks like, but actually there are some core elements that really, you know, won't change. And the first of those, if I share my screen or try to, is around the theory of change. So I think it's, can you, Andrew, can you just let me know if you can see this?
Yes. Yeah,
yes,
you're good.
Right. So apologies, I think a lot of people will know about the theory of change and have done one already, but I do think it's important to sort of outline, to go through quickly, because it is really central to any LUF bid. Ultimately, it's a framework that can be used to sort of develop the strategic narrative, which, you know, needs to be as compelling as possible, but also can support councils to turn a long list of projects into a suitable shortlist for levelling up fund bids. So the first point really is it's slightly counterintuitive that you do start from the start, but then you jump to the end. I'll explain that now. So bar one, pillar one, really is a requirement for the councils with your stakeholders and partners to identify the market failures or the challenges that are being faced by the council, communities and businesses, and to identify what those systemic failures or challenges are, but also the impact that they are having on the council, on communities and on businesses. So to be very clear about what the problems or challenges are and what their impact is, or collectively is. Then through that process, there's a very good starting point there. Then you would move to pillar on the end, which I've numbered number 2. And really you're turning the problem on its head and saying, okay, these are the challenges and these are the negative impacts, but what really does good look like in a sort of long-term impact perspective? So long-term changes in outcomes, whether it be things that, you know, focus on LUF, so, you know, reducing obesity, increasing life expectancy, increasing employment and wage levels and so on. You're really looking for the longer term impacts that you would want to see from any investment. So you have the two sort of extremes then of the theory of change, and then you sort of work back on yourself and ask the question in pillar 3, okay, given the long-term impacts that we're looking to achieve, what are the short and mid-term outcomes to get us to a point where there is long-term impact? So that might be, in terms of obesity, might be increased physical activity, increased inclusion and accessibility of sort of recreation, community assets and so on. So you identify those, and then you go to 4, which is the outputs. So, you know, what needs to happen in a sort of transactional, physical way to make sure that we can achieve those outcomes and long-term impacts. And then finally, you arrive at pillar 5, which is the second from the left. You have this theory of change framework now, which has been developed by the council and your partners and potentially communities and so on. So there's this consensus, just the strategic consensus of what the problem is and how it can be solved. And what column 5 here looks to do, it's a logic test for your long list of projects. If you insert each one of those into column 5, you should be able to answer the question, does this project fit in terms of addressing these challenges and leading to the realization of these benefits? Now, councils often have a long pipeline of capital projects. In terms of the realms of the Levelling Up Fund, if you can get the theory of change right and aligned to the criteria within the fund, this is a very helpful way of identifying the projects or the investments which will be most appropriate for the Levelling Up Fund, as well as providing a really good, accurate, inclusive snapshot of what the challenges are and what the benefits, intended benefits would be. So that really is the theory of change. I would encourage all councils to have a look at, you know, making sure that what you've got in terms of a theory of change is as robust as it possibly can be, because that really is the starting point. Then if we move on to some of the more technical aspects, once you've identified projects that from the long list to short list, there are some questions, and John's already touched on a couple of these. Ask yourself, in terms of maximizing the chances of success in round 3, certain things I think need to be considered. The first is match funding. John's mentioned the sort of advisory 10% minimum, but really ask yourselves the questions, how much match funding could we secure, you know, for this project? And, you know, preferably it is secured match funding by the point you bid at. You can point at something and say, yes, there is a significant match funding which is associated with this project. That benefits in terms of commitment and contribution, but also by definition will reduce the amount of LUF funding you're asking for. So it's, and
that's where the letters of support and things come in.
It is, yes, as well as any sort of, you know, alternative forms of funding which you've identified. Demonstrating the viability gap, I think, is important. I've already talked about that. So it's answering 2 questions. Why is, you know, addressing this challenge or these challenges important? And why does it need a public sector funding response? Why can't you attract private sector investment to address these issues? So that's really important as well, a strong case for investment and demonstration of the viability gap. Additionally, and we've already talked about this, I think Andrew talked about it a few minutes ago, demonstrating a strong link between the projects, the intended benefits, and deprived communities or particular challenges, and those benefits being seen from several angles. The first is the social, the second is the commercial, and the third is the environmental. Each of those perspectives needs to be considered in depth, because essentially that's your benefits framework, and you will need to demonstrate outputs, outcomes, and impacts against each of those. So that really works, I think, as an approach. The ability to demonstrate additionality, that's the attracting of alternative forms of finance, but either immediately or over time. So the LUF project becomes a catalyst to unlock further forms of investment. Obviously, what this boils down to, a lot of it is a positive cost-benefit ratio. So, you know, if you've got a short list of projects, what are the BCRs or the indicative BCRs for each of them? Because you want them as high as possible while obviously being calculated prudently. So these are key things to think about. From a technical perspective, round 2 has shown us that there is a real benefit of having a clear and low risk subsidy control position. So doing the thinking on each project in terms of what the subsidy control position is I think important. Equally, a clear and compliant procurement route for what you're proposing. These are all main focus of DLUC in terms of how they approach the bids. One uncertainty is around deliverability of time. So round 2 projects needed to demonstrate that all LUF funding could be spent by March 2025. Round 4 was, it sort of moves on a year. So I'm assuming in round 3 it will be demonstrate that LUF funding will be spent by March 2026, but you know, they might stick to 25, we don't know, but that's an important consideration. Yeah. And my final point in terms of things that councils could think about now is you both mentioned it actually, increasing awareness and starting to engage with key stakeholders such as MPs, assembly members for devolved administrations, elected members, communities, and so on, and starting that either bottom-up approach in terms of these are the things that we can demonstrate support for, or if you've already got projects, making sure they're the right ones, that you can point to support. So none of this is sort of rocket science, and actually a lot of this is in the guidance already, but these are the things that I think pulling out from our experiences, and also things that councils can do now without really cracking on with the bid process. Getting all these ducks in a row is, I think, really important.
Yeah.
And thinking about your pipeline this way.
Thanks, Mark. That's really useful. I think the bit which has jumped out at me through our experience of this is that you need both a really exciting, engaging vision, the hopey changey stuff, as they called it, but also all those technical bits that you're talking about. Now, I'm sure a lot of people were listening when you started getting into subsidy control and stuff there and think, oh my goodness, but it is really important to get that stuff. I mean, John, how did you find that it ended up a real balance between having an exciting vision and getting excited about that bit, and then realizing, oh, we've got to do all this technical stuff as well?
Yeah, exactly. And it is that balance between the two.
Yeah.
And I think it depends on your audience as well, doesn't it? And obviously, I think for our local partners, having that what did you call it, the hopey whatever stuff,
hopey changey stuff,
changey stuff, yeah, that's a that's the thing that they're interested in. It's like, what is the town centre going to look and feel like in the future if we were to get this funding? So I think that bit is massively important, and I think it does set the frame for your bid as well. That's kind of like the top stuff, but then you absolutely have to have all this technical stuff in place as well, and the stuff to back up your business case and your proposal. And the more of that you've got, the better, and in the form that the government seems to want these things in. And quite frankly, that's where good technical advice comes into its own.
So there's I want to just go to one of the questions we've got here. It's a really interesting one that I've heard this rumor as well. So it's an anonymous question, but civil servants have verbally advised that LUF Round 3 may be an allocation similar to UK Shared Prosperity Fund rather than a competitive bid process. How do the presenters feel about this? And would it be beneficial to the process, particularly those who are priority level 1 and have received no funding from round 1 or 2? The second part of that, I'm not sure, but because we don't know what any of the criteria would be. But no, I've also heard a whispering that it might not be a competitive process. It might be allocation. I've honestly no idea what formula they would use for that. Would areas that have previously received funding get nothing? Would it just be ones who haven't received anything? But regardless of that, if it's like, so let's assume that it was like UK Shared Prosperity Fund, you just would flip your preparing a bid process to preparing an investment plan. So the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, you were required to put together a relatively comprehensive investment plan that still required a theory of change. You needed to be able to pick out what projects that you wanted to fund. So the actual process, particularly leading up to the window, shouldn't be any different, as you're either going to have to do a bid or you're going to have to do an investment plan. The structure of them will probably be quite similar, but I certainly don't think we can give any hints or tips as to what that might look like or who would be eligible or anything like that. But it's a really good point. But it actually, in my view, doesn't change the pre-work that you need to be doing, because you still need to work out what those projects are. You'll still be asked for the benefit cost ratio and things like that. It just might be that you get a guaranteed smaller amount rather than a competitively bid for potentially larger amount. I'm not sure. I don't think we can add much to that, unfortunately. So just a few additional questions here that I've got. So someone's put a question in about, given the uncertainty around the shape and structure of round 3, how can we be sure that the work we plan to undertake ahead of the guidance being issued won't be wasted? Mark, do you have a thought on that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question. I think, what you just said about if there is a different way of doing round 3 and it's on a more sort of shared prosperity fund allocation basis, there is still be a requirement to do some of the core central bits, such as a theory of change, such as an economic modelling to identify the benefit cost ratio, to ensure that people are bought into this idea. So I understand the point, because there is a lot of work that needs to go into what we've talked about today. However, I think the bits that we talked about over the last hour, to get the core fundamentals in place, are immediately transferable between LUF, shared prosperity, and what LUF Round 3 might look like. And actually, equally, I'm working with councils at the moment around Round 3 who are preparing for it, but at the same time saying, well, we're twin tracking this, we're going to go for LUF Round 3, but if we're unsuccessful, we're going to use the work to try and attract other forms of investment. So that process for attracting other forms of investment will need the same sort of work done anyway. So it's a sort of necessary process to go through, irrespective of the route to secure finance. A lot of this is anyway, in my view.
Yeah. John, there's another question come in here just asking what tier Lewisham was in.
So we were priority 2, so we weren't at the kind of highest level of priority, and that's one of the things that stood out for me from that question before about it, was, I absolutely sympathise with areas that are priority 1 and perhaps haven't received any funding yet, but I'd be remiss of me to say that actually everywhere that we agree with the government's approach to putting everyone in one of these 3 boxes, because I think we can all make a case for levelling up in our different areas, and even though, go on, Andrew.
No, sorry, John, I interrupted you.
Yes, we've got some areas that are more affluent in Lewisham, but we've got plenty of areas of deprivation and that do need levelling up, and even within London, there's a need for levelling up and addressing some of those structural inequalities.
I think that's right, and when the methodology for the categorization was revealed, London boroughs were immediately scored down because of having good transport links, for instance. And, so that's not necessarily a sign, that was quite a heavily weighted element of it.
And perhaps if I can pick up on that as well, because that was actually one of the challenges for us, was around transport and the links in our case with TfL as the Strategic Transport Authority. And I guess perhaps, as a bit of advice, similar to what you were saying earlier, perhaps about kind of single tier areas and 2-tier areas and that sort of thing, actually, getting the buy-in of partners and those who might have an influence on it, whether it's county councils or whether it's combined authorities or people with transport powers. Obviously it will depend on the project that you're putting forward, but having their support, or at least them not opposing it, as I think we got to with TfL in the end, is really necessary.
Yeah. So something else I'd really like to explore, which I think everywhere thinking strategically about levelling up should explore. So I mentioned Adam Hawksby from the Onward think tank earlier. He's got this really interesting concept of levelling up fast and slow. So levelling up fast being things like public realm improvements, things that you can do quite quickly, changes in approach to antisocial behaviour, for instance, which in Barry apparently was a really big issue. They changed the policy overnight that people used to arrive by busload into Barry with their kind of drinks carryouts and just kind of sit along the harbour and drink, and then antisocial behaviour would result from that. So what they started to do was the police met the buses, took the drinks and said, you're more than welcome to stay, but you're not going to be boozing here, essentially. So that's an example of levelling up fast, but levelling up slow is that slower inward investment trying to drive prosperity for the next 5 to 10 years. When you're thinking about, in your role, thinking about economy and jobs, John, are you thinking about levelling up through both of those lenses?
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask me to choose one of those two, and again, I was going to have to give the political answer of it's a bit of both, and I think this is partly because we work in a political sphere. When you work it, whether it's local or national government, whatever you work in, there is that need to show some immediate results and to be able to have some happy smiling faces on a press release or a video, and how things have turned around, and that's important, but you can't lose sight of that longer term change, and that bit that's a bit like trying to change an oil tank or move an oil tank around, and town centre regeneration and leveling up absolutely fits into that longer term stuff. But you know, even the longer term stuff starts somewhere as well, and you have to lay those foundations.
Exactly. So just before letting everybody go, one more question here, which I think is very interesting as well. So, and I've heard this rumor also. So, intelligence by our MP is that round 3 will be invitation only, based on unsuccessful round 2 bids. So, i.e., no new bids invited. Is there an indication that the previous bids could be split into individual projects to reduce the ask? This would also obviously impact the benefit cost ratio. I've heard something like that. I think I've probably heard every possible variety of what round 3 might look like. So I thought I'd be really surprised if there was a requirement to submit a carbon copy of your round 2 bid, because the world has moved on, obviously. I have heard something like that, much in the same way as I've heard that it might not be a competitive process, but I'm afraid that they probably don't even know within the department exactly what approach they will take. But it's an interesting point. But again, doesn't change what your immediate pre-work is, I don't think. So look, I just want to draw things to a close there. We will be sending the recording round. We'll send a copy of that slide that Mark used there as well. Please do get in touch with us if you want to have a no strings attached initial conversation, just to help you get straight in your head what you might do next. And with that, just I want to say a huge thank you to John. It's been a real pleasure. And I know our team have really enjoyed working with you and your team in Lewisham, and also Mark. So thanks everybody, and have a really good rest of your day.